it in focus? Yeah, it's in focus. Hey, it's Surya from Inspiration Academy, and today I'm going to be talking about photography. More specifically, I'm going to be talking about composition, right? And what composition is essentially the way that your subject and the things around the subject in the photo are framed and how they're placed in that photo. A common compositional rule is called rule of thirds, and I will be talking about that. But also, more importantly, I'm going to be talking about how to make sure that you have a nice balance between your subject and the context, or the background, and the foreground of your image through composition. You need context for your photos. If you have a story, which most photos are stories, if you have a story without an introduction or without details, then it doesn't make any sense. But if you have a story that just immediately gets to the meat of the story, it doesn't sound good and it doesn't make sense. It does make sense, but it's not as appealing, right? The first thing, rule of thirds. This photo was taken by Ansel Adams, who's a very, very famous landscape photographer who took pictures of Yosemite in black and white in, I think, the 1930s. And he uses the rule of thirds to draw your eyes towards this mountain range, right? That's the focal point of this image, and the focal point is essentially your subject. He uses the S shape of the river to draw your eyes towards this. You can use those to try to draw your subject towards an interesting focal point, like your subject. And the next photo also uses leading lines, just not a curved leading line and not an obvious leading line. So this photo was taken by Joel Meyerowitz, who's a very, very important street photographer. The leading lines may not be obvious since they're out of focus. He breaks rule of thirds, right? You're not supposed to have your subject essentially in the center of your frame, but it works for him because the surrounding area gives context to it. You can see that it's New York, and you can also see the cars, and you can also see the streets and the buildings. And this naturally creates essentially a leading line that draws your eyes toward the subject. And the next photo is a very, very, very symmetrical photo, right? And yes, this also does use leading lines, both with the mountains and also with the pier. But its main focus is symmetry. The horizon is perfectly in the middle, and the person is also perfectly in the middle of the frame. Okay, next is this photo of Childish Gambino, Donald Glover. He was photographed by Gunnar Stahl. Again, Gunnar breaks the rule of thirds, but he creates enough context or negative space around Childish Gambino in his studio to really justify him breaking the rule of thirds. For example, this light, and also I think the red easel that has really good repetition and geometry, add a sort of outline to Childish Gambino's face. This next photo was taken by Fan Ho, who is, again, a street photographer in Hong Kong. And he really creates a sense of isolation in a lot of his photos. And one way to do that is with an L-shaped composition. An L-shaped composition essentially helps create repetition, right? Because it's a right angle. And he uses a lot of geometry in this. And again, this does break rule of thirds. And breaking rule of thirds is okay as long as you give enough context. Rule of thirds could also be good. For example, in this next photo, this was taken by Annie Leibovitz. I think I mispronounced that horribly. And this is the Queen of England. And why this photo looks so regal and looks so not nice is because of the rule of thirds. The Fibonacci sequence, which is what the rule of thirds is based off of, is essentially a spiral in the most aesthetically pleasing way. And it's supposed to be the most aesthetically pleasing mathematical algorithm or mathematical sequence towards the human eye. And the photographer understands this, and she uses the cape to kind of lead your eye towards the queen. And she also uses concentric circles in the rug to kind of create a bunch of circles in the image, which also, again, further reinforce that composition of a spiral leading towards the queen. So this next photo is also Joel Meyerowitz's photo, and this is the police officer is framed directly in the center. And this is still a really good photo, and it still makes a lot of sense since the leading lines of the crowds on the left and the right side, as well as the general color contrast and gradient of the lights at the top and then the darkness of the street at the bottom, which again give context towards the photo, which make it a much better photo than if he just took a photo of the police officer and just put him to one of the corners of the rule of thirds. And then the final photo is taken by Bob Gamel, who is one of my personal favorite photographers, and this is Muhammad Ali. And yes, he does follow the rule of thirds, right? Muhammad's face is in the second, third line, but it also creates two focal points. And this is a very important technique when you want to highlight different things and tell a story through your photos. Because if you just have one subject, sometimes you don't get the whole context or the whole story. But now you can see that he's outside doing his famous pose outside of Fifth Favorite. And it just makes the photo look better since there's two focal points. And that's all the photos that I think have, especially for me, those are the photos I studied to help learn composition, show up series. And I think that studying photos is a great way to learn composition because it forces you to kind of use your own head to figure out what went on in the photographer's mind, especially when taking that photo. Next week, I think I'm going to be talking about color, and I will see you then. Bye.
Hi, we're your IFA co-founders. I'm Ellie.
And I'm Miriam.
And thank you so much for watching our videos.
You guys can learn more about our cause down below at our website, www.inspirationfinearts.org.
And if you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel.
We couldn't be where we are without the support of you guys, so make sure to send in videos of the things that you've learned during classes and pictures of the art that you completed.
Everything you send in will be featured on all our social media platforms.
Thanks for supporting us, and until next time,
go find your inspiration!